Hi, thanks for joining me. Coming to my channel. Um, I want to talk about one of the defining issues of our time, and an issue I think will really shape the 21st century, or at least the first half of the 21st century, and that is the relationship between China and the rest of the world, particularly with the United States. As it stands, the United States is still the number one economy in the world, although it's certainly on shaky grounds. And by most records, the United States is still the most powerful country in the world. But China's rise has been phenomenal. There's no question about that over the last few decades. Um, and this poses a lot of questions that will impact everyone on the planet, actually. Um, are we in a new Cold War? It's difficult to say. We're certainly in something akin to a Cold War. I actually think if this is a second Cold War, not between the United States and Russia, although there's lots of questions around that as well, but between the United States and China, then it will be more complex than the last one on the grounds that we now have the addition of the internet. I really do think that changes the playing field, so to speak, because at the height of the Soviet West Cold War of 1945 to 1991, there was no internet. There wasn't that dynamic of cyber warfare, of internet propaganda, of fake news, all that sort of thing. It just didn't exist. Um, doesn't mean that there weren't real threats then, but I think potentially this is more complex. Well, it is more complex actually, and in part because of the nature of this globalized world, that also adds a dynamic to it because China is actually a hybrid system. It's certainly run by the Communist Party of China. It's a single party system, and ideologically, in that sense, it's communist. However, it is a kind of hybrid economy. It has opened up since 1978 under Deng Xiaoping. You know, China, by contrast to the Mao years, is very much involved in the international community, often for malevolent reasons, in my opinion, but it has a very, very strong presence. It's no longer the mysterious hidden land it was under Mao and before. It's got its fingers in every pie, so to speak. Um, when we look at China today, it's easy to be quite daunted because it is a powerful country. It's the second largest economy. It's a massive military, although I would stress that manpower alone doesn't equate to power. I mean, a modern, well-equipped army of 100,000 men is going to be more efficient than a lackluster army of 1 million men. So it isn't just about numbers, and that could actually be a weakness in the PLA. I'm not sure that their equipment is that wonderful. I'm no military expert, but they have been humiliated by, for example, using stills from Hollywood films in their military propaganda. So I would caution slightly the power of the Chinese military. It's powerful, but I don't think it's as powerful as it may seem sometimes. Um, Nevertheless, it's powerful enough, for example, to retake Taiwan. Um, but yeah, on the surface, it can seem like it's just unstoppable. Um, as if we look at the influence, the CCP, I mean, I'm talking about China in this video, but really, the terms are interchangeable at the moment, China and the CCP. I like to say, we're talking about the Chinese government, not the country. And of course, there's truth in that. The country isn't the party, but the party is so dominant within the country that, in terms of geopolitics, it is hard to separate the two. You could say you respect Chinese culture and the Chinese people and so on, but really, when we're talking about geopolitics, China is the CCP. So unfortunately, that's just the way it is. Um, and it's interesting, a lot of the most vocal Chinese nationals will deny that they're CCP supporters, but for them, it's very much about the motherland. Um, they're fiercely, fiercely patriotic. And of course, as we know, there's a fine line between healthy patriotism and unhealthy nationalism. Um, and the nationalism can be intense. You get it to some degree in a lot of countries, but I think in the case of China, it is some of the most intense around, just in terms of how it is drilled into the psyche of the general populace. Um, and I think there's a lot of ways in which Chinese power is manifested on the world stage. Its influence over the World Health Organization, the UN, and troublingly in Western institutions is plain to see. Um, so I'll be honest, my own feelings are a mixture of, frankly, fear. I don't deny it scares me. It angers me. It angers me because I feel that too many influential people and organizations in the West and other countries are not doing nearly enough to counter this. Um, I believe the CCP is gravely immoral as uh, as a regime. Whatever good they have done, they often boast about lifting millions out of poverty. It doesn't condone the millions they have killed, the millions they have silenced, and the fact that 1.4 billion people are still living under a system which has an iron grip on their lives. Um, it's very, very important to understand how this regime works. Um, so let's just look at its power for a second, because that's very important actually. Big fear is China's going to overtake the United States. I think economically that's a possibility within the next 10, 15 years. Economics is a big thing, but it's not everything. There has been economists have theorized that China will get to the number one spot, maintain it for about 20 or 30 years, then go back down again. The United States will regain itself. A lot of that depends on American leadership. Part of the problem right now is there is a huge question mark over American leadership. I believe that Donald Trump is a very unstable character. Um, this is a president that's often hailed to be very strong on China. In some ways, the fact that the rhetoric has changed is a good thing. I believe Trump has toughened the rhetoric, and that I welcome. But I don't believe that Trump has personally been consistent on China. I don't think that Trump cares about human rights on a personal basis. I've seen no evidence that he has shown any great concern himself for human rights. In fact, when it came to the Uyghur concentration camps, Trump said he thought it would be a good idea. I think a lot of the assertiveness on China comes from Mike Pompeo and the State Department. I give Trump credit for changing the rhetoric, but I think the idea that he's been consistently tough on China, you know, ignores the fact that Trump has often praised the regime as well. It's kind of been this Jekyll and Hyde thing. On one hand, he's launched a trade war against China, and he's rightly, in my view, blamed China for the spread of COVID, although Trump's handling of the crisis, as now manifested by his own health, he's of course tested positive now, has been dire. But yeah, it's very, very difficult to say with the Trump presidency because I don't see it as, okay, this is a president who's being assertive and he's being tough consistently. I don't trust Donald Trump. I don't believe that he is. I think if it was good for business, Trump would be pro China. I really do. But as it stands, I welcome the change of rhetoric because it is true that his predecessors, all the way from certainly from Clinton onwards, were too reconciling towards China. Now, Clinton did raise human rights in a joint meeting with Jiang Zemin, but and so have other American presidents. But the overall narrative from Washington and from other Western governments has, for the last 20 years, been about trying to get China on side. And I think they underestimate the fact that this is a regime that just cannot be trusted. Um, it's very, very important to understand that because I think there's a lot of people in the West who take their eyes off the ball because they're so focused on how awful Trump is, and in some cases they're of a left-wing persuasion that American power is a bad thing. They kind of, it's not that they're necessarily pro-China, I think they take their eye off the ball with just how much a threat the CCP poses. I do believe this is existential. You know, in the past it was bad enough that there was grave human rights abuses within China, um, but under Xi Jinping, the ambitions have went well beyond Chinese borders. Take the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. Take the way China manipulates small Pacific nations, basically to do their bidding in exchange for trade. So it's kind of bully boy diplomacy. In fact, I would say thug diplomacy is now becoming more and more apparent. In the past, the CCP was assertive enough to be diplomatic. That is to say, they would be quite polite, they would be quite diplomatic. But it's noticeable in the last few years, maybe say about the last 3 to 5 years, they've kind of been taking the gloves off. I mean, this is an example when a Chinese state newspaper described Australia as chewing gum on our shoes. We can't look at that as, oh, well, that's Australia. An insult towards Australia is the same as an insult towards Britain or Canada or New Zealand or France or any other democracy. So we cannot take this view that we'll just deal with it on our own. I'm a realist. My country cannot compete with China. The UK is a powerful country, but we're not as powerful as China today. Not. So that's why I believe it is so, so critical that the international community and all freedom loving countries work together whatever internal problems we have. And this is another problem, of course, in the United States. All the racial tensions that are going on there and all the internal culture war schisms are a distraction. They really are. And you're always going to have something akin to that in democratic societies. You're always going to have strong differences of opinion and dissent. But I do think that the optics aren't good. They make America look weak. That charade of a presidential debate the other night didn't help. Um, I certainly veer towards Joe Biden in this race, but I do have concerns about Biden. I do think he is too passive on China. I mean, in the debate, he was careful to point out Trump's pandering to China, so that was quite assertive. But I want to see a President Biden being very tough on China, not just for the sake of sounding tough, but because it's actually the right thing to do. Um, we need leadership from Washington because the United States is the only country that can take on China as an individual country. Now, I believe the United States should be working with its Five Eyes partners. I think we should be working with them. And I believe it shouldn't just be restricted to the Five Eyes, i.e., the United States, Australia, Canada, Britain, and New Zealand. I think that should extend to Western Europe. I believe that Brexit is a distraction, so I hope that we can resolve our differences as soon as possible. Um, but we need to understand the nature of this regime. The only thing the CCP cares about is power. That's all. They are compulsive liars. I mean, I think if you think they can be trusted, you're ignoring history. Um, what particularly concerns me more than what's happening in China itself is the influence the CCP has on Western institutions. We've seen this in universities, and I'm furious, frankly, with our institutions for not waking up to this. I'm not just talking about Confucius Institutes, but generally the way that departments in our tertiary education institutes pander to Beijing's demands. I look at the fact that Ofcom has done next to nothing to act against CGTM, Chinese state mouthpiece. Okay, it probably has a very, very small audience in the UK, but they shouldn't have a base in the UK at all. Why? Because they have aired forced confessions. That is simply incompatible with Western democracy. So why the hell should we give them a platform? Um, there's a kind of very manipulative tactic the Chinese regime uses a combination of bully boy threats and playing the victim. So when people do stand up to them, they're not above playing the racism card, but leaving that aside, they'll talk about the hurt feelings of the Chinese people. So this is plain to see. And, this is not something I take lightly. Even here in the UK, it scares me. I see it online. I see even some of my Chinese contacts, push the propaganda, and it's plain to see some of them I've deleted because I no longer want to see it. Um, I know that every time I post something about, which is periodic, it's not all the time, but if I post something about the CCP, there's a chance that I'll get a nationalistic response, and I take no pleasure from that. But this is the thing, the diaspora, and I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want to generalize. The fact is that because nationalism is so drilled in to the psyche at an early age, you just have to look at Chinese nationals on Facebook or on other Western websites. Um, there's a very, very, very limited amount of critical thinking there. So much of it is subservience to the CCP. And they'll never say that. They'll never say, oh, we love the CCP. But they look at it as, from a nationalistic perspective, oh, you're against China. And it doesn't matter if you tell them you've no problem with Chinese culture or the country. In their mind, you're against China. So they're immediately in a defensive posture. But there is a huge lack of objectivity there because this isn't surprising. They have been indoctrinated from a very, very early age to love the motherland. So if an outsider says anything, even if it's the truth about the CCP and what it's doing, then in their mindset they just can't tolerate it. They just have to go into attack mode. Um, I've experienced this. I've been hacked by Chinese nationalists. I know what they're capable of, and it angers me. I think it's arrogant, particularly if they're studying in Western countries. This is an area where I think we need to be a little bit more, frankly, nationalistic or assertive at least. I don't like nationalism. I don't like nationalism in my own country. But I do think that we cannot win this battle by being nice. We cannot win this battle by just hoping that things change. I remember there was a young woman who she admitted that she herself had been of this mindset, and her view, I forget her name now, it was somewhere in Australia, she said the way to win over Chinese students is by hearts and minds. I'm not sure I agree with that because that's kind of putting the onus on the West, saying, oh, well, we need to just please them. I'm of the opinion that if someone comes to study in Western countries, they have to respect Western countries. And if they are coming here just to promote the CCP and, they want to demand respect, but they don't show much in return, I have a problem with that. Now, I'm not saying that as soon as they get a visa, they should be asked if they're going to be pro CCP or not. It would be practically difficult to do that. Um, but I do think that they cannot complain if people take issue with them being nationalistic on our shores. And the problem is, a lot of lefties would say, oh, that's racist, you can't say that. That's totally absurd. Because what they're turning a blind eye to is the fact that a lot of these mainland Chinese, they come to Western countries and they actively try to intimidate dissent. They've bullied Hong Kong students. Recently, there's been reports that they have complained about being described as Chinazis and so on. Maybe that's a little bit unfair. Maybe it's unfair to smear them all with one brush. But they have to be aware that some of their compatriots are behaving in a way that does China does no favors for China's international image, because what people see is jingoistic arrogance. They see Chinese nationals coming to other countries, making demands to be respected, but not showing much respect in return. My message is simple. Um, you're using our freedom against us. You're saying, oh, because there's freedom of speech in the West, that gives us a right to be insulting. It gives us a right to fly the Chinese flag and fiercely defend the CCP. My simple question or my simple point to those people would be technically you might have that right, but you cannot complain if that is unpopular and if people then challenge you for that. Because I've got news for you. The CCP deserves no respect outside of China. So if Westerners or anyone else, it isn't just about Westerners, Filipinos, Indians, anyone else, China has very few friends in this world under the CCP. Um, if they take issue with Chinese arrogance, instead of getting defensive, then try to consider where this is coming from. Consider that there is such sensitivity around perceived insults towards China. Consider that when you get groups of Chinese nationals waving their flags in other countries, that looks arrogant. But I think that this isn't just about what CCP does. It's a dictatorship. It's going to do what it's going to do. I think the real problem, actually, in some ways, lies in those Westerners, Western companies like Disney and others that pander to the CCP, that basically cave in to their sensitivities and essentially give them what they want. I think this is an absolute abomination. And if we do get into a situation further down the line where CCP starts controlling the internet, and this isn't paranoia, I think this is very plausible, then the people to blame will not be the CCP. They're going to do what they're going to do. You know, why wouldn't they? It's almost natural. The people to blame will be those fools who thought that they couldn't stand up to China because it might be bigoted, it might be xenophobic. It is perfectly compatible to oppose the CCP, oppose its agenda, whilst not being racist towards individual Chinese. I insist on that. But I do think that the time for our approach to this has changed. For too long, the West has tried the softly, softly approach. It simply hasn't worked. So we need to start laying down the rules. We need to start saying we're not going to discriminate, for example, against Chinese nationals if they want to, obviously outside of COVID, if they want to study or work or live in the West. That's fine. But they need to respect Western countries and they need to understand very clearly that the West is not China and there is no necessity whatsoever for anyone to respect the CCP. Because in Western countries, we have the freedom to criticize the CCP, and there is enough ground to criticize them. Now, Chinese nationalists might say, oh, but what about our freedom of speech? I'd say, okay, you've got that, but just be prepared to be called hypocrites, because that's what you are. If you are using websites like Facebook, which are banned in China, in order to promote the same party that bans it, that's just sheer hypocrisy. I really, really do think that this is one of the biggest issues facing the world today, along with climate change, pan Islamist extremism, of course, COVID, but COVID isn't going to last forever. You know, coronavirus is a world defining event, but it isn't going to be as long lasting, I don't think, as issues like climate change and fight against poverty and all those sort of things that are ongoing. But definitely, definitely, how the world responds to the CCP will define this century. And at the moment, I am very concerned. I believe nowhere near enough is being done. I believe that powerful Western institutions have their head in the sand. I am furious with our universities for bending over backwards to Chinese demands. Um, I'd like to see a lot more concrete action, even if that includes the expulsion of diplomats. Of course, the CCP will bark about that. They won't like it. Chinese state media will be in overdrive in their jingoistic rants about the West. I would also say this. I would urge anyone who's thinking about going to China right now, as someone who's been to the country twice and lived and worked there twice, believe me, things are only getting worse in terms of how they view Westerners. I'm not talking about the average Chinese person. I'm talking about the government. And just be aware, if you go there, whether you're a tourist or particularly if you're working as a teacher or something else, they will find the flimsiest of excuses to pick you up and basically use you as a hostage. That's what they're now resorting to, hostage diplomacy, where they pick up Westerners or others, accuse them of on trumped up charges, and then try to put the West in this position whereby they have to barter for the release. That's what's happening with the two Canadian Michaels, two men accused of espionage, but they've had no access to lawyers, minimal access to their families. It's a disgrace. Um, so basically, I want to see a situation where we start standing up to these thugs in Beijing. This is a thuggish regime, and I'm sick and tired of this idea that we bend over to their sensitivities. We need to start using, frankly, some of the language to them. You know, um, the nicely approach just hasn't worked. I'm not saying we be reckless. I'm not saying we cut off ties 100%. Even at the height of the Cold War, there were some connections between the Soviet Union and the West. There was a hotline and so on. So I'm not saying totally cut off links 100%. That would be impossible in an interlinked world. And there are areas, perhaps, for example, in counterterrorism operations, climate change, and some other issues that we might have to work with China. But we need to understand that this cannot be business as usual. It can't. It just needs to be understood. And for anyone else who feels the same way I do, we shouldn't be scared about speaking out. I mean, there's nothing the CCP can do to me in this country, but I am aware that every time I speak out, there's a chance that Chinese nationals could target me. Now, a bit of name calling and disagreement's one thing, but I've been hacked before because these people are so thin-skinned and so intolerant to dissenting views, and so brainwashed into getting into this knee-jerk nationalistic defense. Um, they don't think critically. Um, so yeah, it angers and scares me. But I'll close with a more optimistic thought, and it's this: China is powerful, but it's not all powerful. That power is not absolute. There are actually cracks in the seams within China. Although on the surface the CCP has an iron grip on control, there is growing dissent within the country, not just what's happening in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, but now in one of the latest moves they've interfered with Mongolian culture in the Chinese region of Inner Mongolia, where they're trying to force Putonghua lessons, for example, and they're eroding the Mongol culture. That's a mistake, as although that's part of China technically, it is an autonomous region, and I think that the more this sort of thing happens, the more cracks are going to appear, it seems. There's also actually quite a lot of internal dissent within China. Of course, the state always covers it up, but there are significant industrial disputes, things to do with, for example, land clearance schemes. There's a lot of things that are going on that the CCP would love to cover up. So, they present this image of the world of a harmonious society. It really isn't. Um, what else can I say? Yeah, I mean, the other optimistic side is we're talking about one country against many. Fundamentally, I can't think of a time in history, not many times, where a single power has beaten many powers. It might have happened a few times, and there's been examples in history of powerful central powers. For example, Napoleonic France, and in the beginning of World War II, of course, the Third Reich. There's been other examples where they've maintained power for a long time, but sooner or later, it's just a law of a law of common sense. One country cannot take on many, and the fact of the matter is, China really has very few true friends in this world. It's close to Pakistan for trade reasons, but I don't believe that's an ideological friendship. I believe it's for just geopolitical reasons. Pakistan obviously sees China as a bulwark to India, and China likewise. Um, North Korea, well, it's a failed state run by a tin pot tyrant. Russia, okay, Russia might be one big exception. It's a powerful country, and there's generally good relations between Moscow and Beijing. But Russia itself also has is not without weaknesses. So I'm broadly optimistic because China simply cannot take on the United States, Britain, Western Europe, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, the Philippines, India. The list goes on. China can't take on the whole world, and that's what these arrogant communists in Beijing need to understand.